Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and yours are safe and sheltering in place in a comfortable environment. We look forward to seeing you back in the Yacht Club just as soon as conditions permit. Our speaker today can remember being a Cub Scout, canoeing and rowboating and kayaking in the lakes around Newton, Massachusetts, and on the Charles River as a little boy. And then he can remember bass fishing as a teenager in Western Massachusetts. And then he finally got his first kind of like job, and it was a quasi job because he was a boat patrolman for the Massachusetts Park System in Framingham, Massachusetts, skippering his own 16-foot Starcraft. He went on to get official basic seamanship training at the training center in Pensacola, Florida for the U.S. Navy. Went on to get a bachelor's degree in recreation at UMass Amherst. 3, count them, 1, 2, 3 master's degrees, 1 in leadership, 1 in counseling, and 1 in criminal justice. And then get a doctorate in education from Seton Hall. He would go on to become a director of applied research and analysis at the Wargaming department at the Navy War College, and is currently an endowed chairman of the National Strategic Decision Practice and a full professor at the Navy War College. Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, Dr. Hank Brightman.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I will start out by saying that everything that I'll share with you today, of course, are my own insights and perspectives, not those of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or the U.S. Navy. That said, there are some really important points that we'll work through together, starting with the fact that the game that we'll talk about today, Urban Outbreak 2019, existed long before COVID-19. And while a lot of what we'll talk about is informative, it's not predictive, because COVID-19, as the name implies, is a novel virus. It never existed before. So we continue to learn about it as time goes on. That said, we felt there was great value at the Naval War College in developing a game, and developing a game several years ago, born from discussions that we had had with academicians, with military leaders, with civilians, with lots of different people about how to best work together with seemingly disparate actors in a response environment. That brought us to a point where we decided to build a game. And the game that we built, which is referred to as Urban Outbreak, was held in September of 2019 at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab in Laurel, Maryland. It was a co-sponsored event by the Naval War College, by the Uniformed Services University's National Center for Disaster Medicine and Public Health, and of course, Johns Hopkins APL. And it was the first time that we really brought together people from different organizations, like non-governmental organizations, along with military actors, international militaries, private sector representatives, and a spate of government personnel, local, federal, international as well. The way that we wanted to test their ability to work together and to learn from each other was to construct a game that was played over 2 days that encapsulated 3 moves. And those moves really focused on how to best work together based on the priorities that would be set in pandemic response, and how to work together with other organizations to achieve those priorities. To do that, we really stressed in this game, and you'll see it as we discuss it later on, cross-coordination, working across stakeholders. Because of the sensitivity of the content, and again, there was no COVID-19 at the time, we decided to build a fictional entity, and that fictional entity was known as Olympia. It's a fictional megacity with about 21 million people, located in a notional developing nation known as Olympus. Yes, it was coastal, it was complex, and what was really important was the high degree of poverty, of low socioeconomic status in this particular urban environment. People didn't have access to medical infrastructure, adequate public health infrastructure, including a viable public water supply. And most of their medical services were provided either using alternative medicines or in many cases unlicensed providers using off-specification medication. And of course, as you would suspect in a developing nation, there were also challenges with pollution and contamination from hazardous and toxic waste. To really focus on stressing that cross-coordination, the game centered around 3 scenario-based moves. Move 1 focused on the outbreak itself. Move 2, emphasizing what happens when things really get bad and you have those cascading failures when systems start to break down. Then of course in move 3, the transition towards stability, when militaries start to move out and other organizations start to move in. For the actual pathogen or bug, we decided to use something that was readily treatable. Because again, the real challenge that we had here was not the enigma of a pathogen, but a lack of access to infrastructure for medicine and public health. So this was a bug or an event that focused on a non-viral entity. So this wasn't like COVID. That's very important to understand. This was bacterially based, not virally based, and it was easily treatable using antibiotics. The challenge, of course, how do you get those antibiotics to an impoverished population with a degraded infrastructure for receiving that aid? And as you can see, because we had so many people ill so quickly, this was deemed a public health emergency of international concern, which means that other countries, other governments, other organizations could be brought into the response. So what I'd like to do now is take that container, if you will, of urban outbreak and what we learned throughout these 3 moves and align that and connect that with the challenges we're seeing in COVID-19. And to do that, I'll really focus on the US domestic response for most of what we'll discuss today. Again, realizing that this is not predictive, but rather informative. What we really saw were challenges of coordination and communication. As I said in move 2, when things really got bad within that country and within that city, that's when we really saw that coordination break down the most. And that's not to be unexpected, given the fact that as a developing nation, Olympia, the city, had challenges that were much more exhaustive than Olympus, the country, could handle, which is why other nations were brought in. So we had a local Ministry of Health within the city of Olympia, but we didn't really have much in terms of national assets available to us across the country. Contrast that now with how other countries are dealing with COVID-19 and how other regions are dealing with COVID-19. For example, if you look at the World Health Organization European model, they realized early on that they had to develop a system or system of systems where stakeholders across all of these different entities could be engaged. And that's exactly what they did. And if you look at that model, you can see the synergy that exists and why numbers have historically been relatively low in terms of COVID over time, contrasted with the US. As you extrapolate that to the larger European Union notion, you can see here how the countries within the EU at both a national level and subnational level have worked together to synchronize their efforts towards what we call unity of effort. And that's where everyone's working together towards a common concern. And this has very much been the structure that we've seen across Europe in COVID-19 response. Even when we talk about developing nations, and in the model I'm sharing with you now, we're looking at Sudan, you can see this elegant command and control structure where we have the ability to identify challenges that we're seeing, even with displaced persons, and how we'll treat them in terms of COVID-19 response. Contrasting that with the United States. And what's really interesting is when we built this game and we looked at Olympus and Olympia and the developing nation and this mega city within the developing nation, we never really thought about the United States, because surely the United States would be prepared to respond to some type of a pandemic or pathogenic catastrophe. What we learned very quickly is we're not. And the reason that we're not is that much of the national response framework, as I've shown you here for the United States, is focused on domestic local level response. And that local level response has different degrees of strength and capability. In California, where I know many of you are right now, one department might have adequate firefighting resources, whereas another department may not, which is why they tend to band together and work together in a larger framework, because no smaller entity could do that on their own. We have larger systems, much like when we talk about firefighting in California, at the national level. But quite frankly, we didn't use them. So what happened very, very quickly with COVID-19 is we went from having the opportunity to unify coordination, having that unity of effort like I shared with you in the European model, to basically 50 or perhaps 43 if you count regional responses or micro regions, responses to the same pathogen, COVID-19, all being addressed differently, and all again relying heavily on that local response effort, realizing there were different levels of capability and prowess to those local levels. That's the challenge that we have. Since day one, there has never been a national unified response to COVID-19. So why does that matter? Why do we care that there hasn't been a national response, that we've left it to states and in some cases sub-state entities to decide what they want to do and when they want to do it? Well, one merely needs to look at those states that reopened, when they reopened, and the trends of reopening contrasted with where we are today. And again, if you look at that first slide and this slide, you can see that those states that reopened first are really in the worst shape right now. Because of the lack of a national unified response, because we allowed states to rely on their own devices and even subsystems within those states to develop their own responses, we don't have any kind of a unity of effort that's fighting the bug in the way that we need to. Other things that we learned from this game are critically important to our exploration of COVID-19 as well. For example, social behaviors matter immensely. Whether we're talking about in Olympia or we're talking about within the United States. In Olympia, the players did a fantastic job of very quickly developing a common message through radio, through pamphlets, through literature, through education, to really get the public to understand the importance of things like hand washing, of distancing, of doing all the things that they needed to do in response to that pathogen, that notional pathogen that they had in their country. You contrast that kind of a consistent social messaging with us in the US today, where somehow this has become some kind of unusual discussion on individual liberty, contrasted with what's best from a public health perspective. And in the slide that I'm sharing with you, you can see that what's fascinating about this to me is I put some old posters from World War II up here, where we had that same kind of unity of effort. Somehow we've created this divide between the mask wearers and the non-maskers as a liberty issue, which is certainly a sharp contrast to what we saw in World War II. And it doesn't help that the signals that we get at national levels are confusing as well. We're told one thing, we're told another thing. There is a lack of consistency in terms of even rudimentary safeguards like mask wearing and how much those can actually help. We also see that there's failure in systems. And when one system fails, another system cascades and fails as well. We saw that, of course, when we talk about Olympia, where they had such a fragile connective tissue, as it were, to each system, that was to be expected. But what we didn't expect is perhaps in the United States with COVID-19, that same level of disruption. So when we start to talk about things like protests, and regardless of the cause that we're talking about, we can actually map those protests to spikes that we see in COVID cases. And I've done that for you here with the two images I provided for Wisconsin and Minnesota. And that's the challenge that we have, again, is these cascading failures. As people become ill, that requires more hospital services. That requires taking bed space. That requires degrading infrastructure that's critically needed. What's also very important that we learned from Urban Outbreak that certainly can be pulled through to our event as well is the importance of the private sector and why the private sector really matters pre-response, during response, and in the later phasing of a response too. That often the private sector is better at sustainment and resupply than the military or other organizations will ever be. What's interesting, again, is if you don't think through those sustainment and supply issues, we run out of toilet paper. And when you think about that, how do we deal with that? Not just when it's things that are relatively viable like toilet paper, but other items like food and water. We end up with looking at secondary and tertiary supply chains to provide those services, which is why, fortunately, in our nation, we've been able to rely now on a lot of the third-party supply chain, some of the major online entities to provide us with that support. But that's not a great model if we're not thinking that through in advance, because if any of those drivers or other sustainment hubs become degraded, then we don't have the capability to resupply. Two other important things that we learned were the way that non-governmental organizations focus on public health and the way that militaries focus on public health are different. And those differences are important to understand, because in the United States, what we tend to see with COVID-19 is a marked distinction between the level of risk our military forces will assume responding to COVID-19 contrasted with what public health entities will provide. While public health entities are great at providing that response, quite frankly, there just aren't enough of those folks out there to take care of a population in need. If the military's focus is on protecting the force rather than protecting that population, there's immediately a chasm or a dissonance within that system. And we see that, for example, with what happened with the USNS Comfort. If you're familiar with that, in my opinion, it was a debacle. There were basically about 3 people who ended up getting treated. It didn't work as a concept because the ship became infected, the Comfort became infected very quickly, and it was inoperable for the mission it had been assigned. They would have been much better off simply trying to create more field hospitals than bringing the Comfort into play for the role that it tended to use. In the lower right-hand side of this picture, you can see here the military forces that we have. If military forces are focused on being ready to respond to conflict, that often means they're not able to respond to these kind of events. So there's a lot of operational risk management that goes into this decision-making. And again, shows that dissonance between military forces providing support and the private sector or non-governmental organizations providing support. Of course, silos and specialization. When we talk about bureaucratization, that's something that we see prevalent in all types of response. And certainly in the case of COVID, even with things that allow us to use wartime production practices, we haven't used that to the level that we need to. Even if we were to fully make this country making masks and ventilators and other items, the process for that is not as elegant or as simple as one might think. And I'll show you an example of that. This is the traditional integrated defense acquisition model. So one need only take a moment to pause and look at this chart to understand the complexity that's involved in acquisition within defense logistics. What's important to understand here is that while many of these elements could perhaps be hastened in a wartime production footing, they do still exist. And there are a lot of authorities that we deal with that generate the complexity. Okay, so I've talked a lot about what we learned in urban outbreak, how it applies to our current COVID-19 response in the US. You're probably asking, that's great, Hank, but what would you do differently? What should we or could we be doing differently? Well, I'd proffer to all of you that what we could be doing is a lot more with wargaming and simulation that we're currently doing. And we could do a lot of that virtually to protect folks from the ravages of COVID-19. For example, we could develop a game that has 4 cells or 4-player entities focused specifically on manning and organizing forces, equipping those forces, and looking at those from most likely and most dangerous scenarios, what we call scenario-based planning, and how those different organizations would then deal with things like coastal transportation, how they would deal with providing the supply chain that we need to, if that were to go down, as I addressed earlier in our conversation. Then we'd take a little bit of an operational pause we would develop some courses of action around those dangerous and likely situations. And we apply a number of simulation tools. For example, two of my favorites that I use look at Bayesian time influence networks and Nash equilibrium as ways to model complex problems in a non-linear environment. And I think we'd all argue that the challenges and catalysts to instability within COVID-19 really are non-linear at this point. I could probably build this model in about a 40-hour war game. And my perspective is that this would have value to senior decision makers in the decisions that they could then make, provided we were to look at COVID-19 as a national response. And to date, that's been the big challenge. We haven't. We've looked at this as a micro level, compact or state level response. There are a number of resources I'd point your attention to as well. The quick look from the Urban Outbreak game and the post-game findings are available for public review that go into much more detail on the content that we covered here. And yes, through the Naval War College Foundation, I had an opportunity to share a little video that talks about some of these findings and also how they lean into COVID-19 response, at least within the states of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So failing any questions, that concludes my presentation. And I'm very interested in any thoughts and questions you may have for me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Hank. Well, so first, right off the bat, I've got to get to the bottom line. If I take a look at the number of people who've thus far died, 200,000, right off the bat, it's remarkable to see how lethal the pandemic is compared to what we think of as wars. The Vietnam War, we lost 58,000 Americans. The Korean War, we lost 40,000 Americans. World War I, we lost 116,000 Americans. World War II, we lost, 405,000 Americans. And this is, of course, all of these are over multiple years. The Civil War, 620,000 Americans, the most deadly of all the wars, for heaven's sakes. Right now, we're looking at, we could lose 2/3 as many in 1 year of this pandemic. So I see the value of why the Navy War College would be wargaming events like the pandemic, because in fact, they're far more lethal than wars using submarines and battleships and missiles and giant military forces. We spend, is it around $800 billion a year on the military? And we don't spend, I know what we spend on public health, but clearly I see why you guys are wargaming this particular activity. I mean, the Revolutionary War cost 25,000. The Afghanistan War, 6,000. The Gulf War, like under 2,000. 9/11, again, like 3,000. And so this is an incredibly lethal activity. So am I right in observing that the bottom line net overall conclusion of the war game is that a national response is far more productive and safer and less lethal than localized responses, and that you originally assumed that the fictional city of Olympus and the fictional country Olympia, etc., that these would not have an efficient nationalized response, that the U.S. would have an efficient nationalized response. Is that the net bottom line conclusion? An assumption you went with?
Ron, that's 100% accurate. There's none of us, I can't say none of us, but I'd be really surprised if there was anyone that I know of who thought that there would not be a national response to COVID-19. And I understand the concept of individual liberties and having states' rights. I get it. I understand the way the United States is organized as a democratic republic. However, what I would argue is when the PATCO air traffic controllers went on strike, President Reagan didn't say, you know what, you're right, but this is really a state or local problem. We'll let them come up with their own air traffic controllers, and we'll figure it out later on. He fired
Every airport for itself. We didn't say that.
Yeah, Reagan, who is the ultimate states' rights champion, brought the U.S. military in as air traffic controllers until such time as they could reestablish a viable air traffic control system.
In your fictional city, Olympus is the fictional country and Olympia the fictional city. And you said 21 million was your estimated modeling size. Give me a real world city that would fit with this model. Where would that be? Like Nairobi, where?
Sure. So again, not that we looked at any individual city for our model. However, certainly in the real world, a city like Lagos, Nigeria would definitely be equivalent, if not larger, in fact.
And the reason you modeled a third world city and country like that is because you assumed that a third world city or country would not have an efficient response. And that would be give me the description of what kind of response you imagined such a third world country would have.
So when we look at developing nations, we really focus on where they tend to get their resources and need. And often that need is provided by non-governmental organizations. Since we wanted to bring them into this game to see how they would coordinate with military entities, with national actors, with whole of government entities, that's why we focus this on a developing nation as opposed to what we traditionally would consider an industrialized nation.
Right. So just in terms of the way the War College works on issues like this, how long did it take you guys to design this war game?
Right. So interestingly, the gestation period for a game is normally about the same as human life. So for us, it's usually about a 9 months process. But in the wargaming department, done often by a team or a cadre of people, all with talent and expertise building that product. For us at the Naval War College, in the CivMil Humanitarian Response Program where I work, as opposed to the wargaming department, it was a more agile effort. So it took us about 6 months, and we used a core game team of 3 people to help develop our product. So a much lighter footprint, if you will, in terms of developing the game. The challenge with that becomes that on the back end, when you have voluminous data to sift through, without that larger gaming team, it can be hard to do the post-game analysis.
Now, you guys did this war game in September 2019, literally 4 months before the average American even heard about COVID-19. And so there you are, having just created this product, having learned about it and watched the military officers that you showed this to, they had a response to it. Then all of a sudden, real life chases up with your modeling. And all of a sudden, you're looking around. Tell me what reaction you personally and professionally had as you began to see the COVID-19 pandemic mushroom out of control.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ron. The challenge is most often that academicians tend to work in an ivory tower. And this was a case where the ivory tower was unfolding in reality all around us. And what we saw is many of the takeaways or lessons learned from our gaming had applicability to the COVID response, but even when pushed to those with decision-making opportunity, they weren't necessarily embraced. So our projections on fatality, on what we call mortality, were much higher than some of the initial models, and unfortunately tend to be trending more accurately now.
So if you were now knowing what you know as an academician in the war game in the War College, give me from start to now, start to 8 months into the pandemic, tell me exactly what should have happened from your academic perspective with the full benefit of hindsight and your modeling experiences. What should have happened in January, February, March, etc.?
What I strongly argue should have happened from day one is a much more serious response that balanced public safety over economic prowess and balanced the need for immediate response over competition within the industrial sector. And I'll go a little further with that. At the framework level, this should have been a national response framework. It should have been run by a centralized entity, not necessarily the military. Centers for Disease Control have authorities to affect certain kinds of processes in a way that protect individual liberty, but also protect the broader population. And that could have been done much sooner as well. Had those things happened, we likely wouldn't have seen the mortality and morbidity counts that we've seen to date, where many states are fighting for the same resources, often against each other. And we certainly saw that with ventilators and masks early in the response effort. It stabilized somewhat, but as we go into the second wave, likely in the next few weeks, that's likely to reappear. And the reason that I mentioned using game theory earlier when we talked about how I would wargame this is that there's an old saying, corruption is a Nash response.
What's Nash response mean?
So
Nash.
Nash is named after John Nash, who is the father of Nash equilibrium and game theory, who came up with the idea that if cooperative parties work together, they accomplish more than if they work at odds against each other. And there's a related concept called Rubinstein bargaining, which says that the longer it takes to come to that point, the less value that decision has over time. So if we had built a model that was cooperative and collaborative rather than competitive from the beginning of the response, or even now as we lean into the second phase, if we would readjust our attitude and efforts in that area, there's a lot we could do to save lives and get this country moving again in a way that's safe and healthy.
When you say cooperative and collaborative, who are the parties in the cooperation and collaborative model?
So all of the different sectors that we talked about in the urban outbreak game, that would include private sector entities, military entities, state governments, federal government, local government, anyone who has a hand in understanding how the outcome affects them. So pretty much everybody is a stakeholder in this particular model. And because of that, we need to use a modeling technique that accounts for all of those stakeholders like game theory. And if we don't do that, we're leaving out huge groups of stakeholders who either feel marginalized or that the process doesn't apply to them.
And so in your idealized, most efficient response, it sounds like you're suggesting that an entity such as the Center for Disease Control could have taken over the planning and implementation of a unified national American response to the threat, which has now killed 200,000 Americans. And that essentially have I got that right?
So in the world, according to Hank, this would have been a CDC-led effort with, as their lieutenant or adjunct, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Because ironically, nobody knows more about particulate and respiratory protection than OSHA. And they've been marginalized from this entire response. There are existing statutes and regulations, and I can actually give them to you if you want, that come into play that look at things like permissible exposure levels and what's immediately dangerous to life and health and medical monitoring that could all have been applied from the beginning. But OSHA, to my knowledge, has been marginalized from this entire process. The Bureau of Labor has pretty much been reduced to a funding mechanism for unemployment and other kinds of reemployment opportunities at this point.
One other question I'd had, which seems so basic, is I've been always wondering about per capita metrics when looking at the entire pandemic. You know, there's no learning without comparison, and it's more efficient to compare the death rate in California to that of South Dakota or Louisiana if you look at the per capita death rate, since the states are all different sizes, such different sizes. I noticed in your analysis, you showed a per capita number right off the bat. So so talk to me about the value of having, unified metrics by which to measure metrics or events in war games.
Yeah, it's a great question. Numbers can have different meaning. They can be qualitative or quantitative. They can be nominal or ordinal. And what I mean by that is the numbers that matter are the ones you just alluded to, Ron. It's that per capita rate, both for mortality, for morbidity, for disease, and mortality for death, that really matter in this case. And when every state has the ability to count numbers differently and use them in different ways, those can feed policymakers or other organizations in ways that may have value for them, but not necessarily for the collective good.
Okay, now when you say war college, everybody thinks about traditional war adversaries. And we think about, for instance, the Russians, who seem to be constantly wanting to hurt America in any way they can. Not because they want to sell more cars than us, because they can't compete with us in that arena. They certainly can't make better, you know, home appliances for us. They can't sell, they don't make better technology than us, but they do constantly try to hurt, it seems to me, as a citizen, America in every which way they can. Right now, how are the ways that they're using this tragedy that's happening in America to advance their national interest, to constantly be hurting America? Is it disinformation? Is it to create a dissent within America? How would you be worried as a war college planner with the way that Russia will use this pandemic to advance their interests?
I preface my comments with, we look at the national defense strategy as part of our overarching academic portfolio for where we'll lean our thinking and our research. And if you look at the national defense strategy, the national military strategy, and of course the national security strategy, everything points towards what we refer to as great power competition. And if you're not familiar with great power competition, or GPC, it really speaks mostly to two near-peer competitors, China and Russia. And both of those actors are actors that are, from my perspective, taking advantage of the current, if you will, churn within our system for response to their own advantage through disinformation, through false news stories, through sowing seeds of discontent, as you alluded to, within the United States. And those have far-reaching effects, whether we're talking about racial divides or we're talking about influencing the potential for confidence in a vaccine once it's available, which again, if people don't take a vaccine, could further reduce our ability to regain our GDP, our gross domestic product, in a way that keeps us competitive with those other near-peer competitors. There's lots of different areas, including the election, where both China and Russia appear to be trying to use their influence to dissuade US confidence from our democratic republic system in which we live.
What is the potential that you've considered for direct military response of a foreign country during a time when our national leader, the President of the United States, is literally taken to the hospital?
So when we apply the broader concept of DIME, or diplomatic, information, military, and economic, to the current challenges we're having with COVID-19, it's more likely that those kinds of state actors, China, Russia, for example, would use information and economic measures to try and harm the United States than direct kinetic military action, because that's obviously highly attributable. And that's something that could in many ways create a cohesion among the American people that works against their intended outcome in those other countries. That said, I would be obviously not realistic if I didn't state that there are likely non-state actors, both domestically and abroad, who have a desire to use the current challenges we have within the United States to either reduce confidence in the democratic republic system in which we live, or to potentially carry out certain types of incidents or events as a way to further erode confidence in policing and security and other elements of the United States.
We've heard lots about compromise lately, and the notion that a foreign actor could use private information, embarrassing information about a leader to extort that leader into a certain course of action. How often have you modeled foreign, negative foreign actors influencing decision-making inside the American executive?
So routinely, when we do our operational security profile and assessment of all clearance holders and other folks within the whole of government who have the ability to access information that could cause harm to the United States, we assess the potential for extortion, the potential for blackmail, those kinds of concepts that you're referring to, regardless of what state actor we may be referring to. The challenge, of course, is that that kind of blackmail or extortion only works when someone has something that they're hiding. Enigmatically, what we've tended to see in the age of social media is a willingness or an ability of many senior decision makers to air their own dirty laundry themselves, if you will, and not necessarily have an element of shame or humility around that. So in the past, that would probably have certainly been true, but with kind of channeling my inner Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan with defining deviance downwards, if enough people don't necessarily see something as a big deal, and that particular individual is willing to air their dirty laundry in public, probably doesn't have as much of an influence as one might think.
So now, how often do you guys design these war games? How many war games will you do a year?
Right. So in the program that I'm currently working in, the Civilian Military Humanitarian Response Program, we're a much smaller shop than the Wargaming department. So we'll average 3 to 4 in-person games and several online simulations and other events a year. The Wargaming department averages 8 to 12 major games a year that are actually determined by senior level leadership of the Department of the Navy and the Defense Department. You would want to talk to them more specifically about their gaming portfolio at present and how COVID-19 has impacted that as well. But I will say that even as COVID ravages all of us, the work goes on, and we figured out ways to do gaming creatively without necessarily bringing people together in the same room where they could have vulnerability to the COVID-19 virus.
How long will it take for the COVID-19 failed response to get in the textbooks or history books of war colleges like yours to basically be a case study?
We have failed responses in everything we do. So I don't want to single out COVID. There are always opportunities for learning from those less developed elements of response. So as an example, we currently study Hurricane Katrina, and the challenges of response as part of our defense support for civil authorities portfolio. So our students will actually study the things that went well and the myriad things that did not go well in Katrina response as part of their curriculum. So I have no doubt that as we lean into future classes at the Naval War College, we'll see greater emphasis on this because it's a textbook opportunity to look at the challenge of not having unified action or leaning into unity of effort. And that's really what this comes down to.
So when you take a look at other countries that have responded well, which countries, you mentioned South Korea, would it be fair to simply prioritize per capita death rates and attribute those countries with the lowest per capita death rate as those who've had the most efficient response to this pandemic?
I don't think it's as simple as that, and it's not as linear as that, because you have to look at different ethnographic elements within a society and their belief systems. A more monolithic society where people tend to have a common set of shared values or belief system, religion, race, or origin, it may be easier to develop a response in some cases because some of those disparate elements are already accounted for. What I do think works well is the hammer of fine or economic condition. The country that I would really point to right now as efficacious in the response, while South Korea is certainly there, would be Canada. And if you look at the rate of infection in Canada, it's far, far lower than the United States, even though we share a border. And much of that has to do with the substantial fines that are provided to folks who choose not to follow the regulations for public health. and specifically things like transiting around the different provinces without approval or authority or testing.
Looking forward, what's your biggest worry as a war planner looking at where America is at this minute? What's the next big worry for you?
So the next immediate worry is it's getting colder, it's getting darker, people are going inside, and they've reached what I call a COVID fatigue, where even those people that have been dutiful in wearing masks and social distancing will reach a point of assignation where eventually they'll start to connect to other people as the season gets darker and perhaps there's more of a need for a social connection, that if by November we haven't figured out ways to effectively manage COVID other than masks and distancing, that fatigue factor will cause people to come together, and that coming together will be the worst thing they can possibly do. And that will create significant spikes in the disease that will carry with us through the holiday season and into the new year.
And through the election.
And assuredly through the election.
Okay, so I've got to just ask a question. Give me a piece of good news. Is there anything good that you can see? Anything that's happened lately that's good that you like?
Yeah, there are several good news stories. So probably the one that's most prominent is what we've learned is that we can do vaccine development far more rapidly than we have in the past, while also maintaining those traditional hypothesis deductive approaches that allow us to safely determine the best vaccine to use in response to a pathogen. We're still doing this the right way. For my folks out there who tend to live in the scientific world, we're still leaning into the null hypothesis. We're not basing decisions in hopes of a relationship. The FDA is still doing testing the right way. They've just figured out ways to hasten the process. So I would say that that is a good news story, along with the fact that from an influenza perspective, this has created an awareness around influenza as a secondary or comorbid factor, meaning that lots of people that in the past did not get flu shots are likely getting them now. And people are becoming more cognizant of influenza controls like hand washing and distancing in ways that they might not have in the past. Whereas people might have gone to work with the flu in the past or not gotten a flu shot. The good news is I think that some people are actually developing better habits because of that. And the third thing I'd say, Ron, is from a technology standpoint, I know that I have an opportunity to talk to folks in the San Francisco Bay Area. Technology has exploded as a result of COVID-19. The Zoom call that we're on now, the ability to do work virtually, the ability to develop flexible work practices in a way that meets employer demands, but also may preserve some quality of life for employees as well. Those are success stories out of COVID-19.
Well, Dr. Hank Brightman, full professor at the Navy War College in Newport, Rhode Island. It's been a pleasure listening to you talk to us about wargaming the pandemic. And I'm very thankful that we have you and your colleagues working at the Navy War College. I wish we would have been able to listen to your advice a little bit more coherently at the beginning of this pandemic. And by we, I mean the royal we. Thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to your next visit to the West Coast when the Yacht Club could show you a full facility indoors, and wish you great health out in Newport, Rhode Island. And with that, the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon is adjourned. Thanks, Hank. Good talking to you, mate. Thanks.